My name is Matt Soule, and I want to show you how you can leverage the key pathways of stress to propel you toward your best life. Let's get started. When was the last time that you said, I want to learn this skill, but suck at it? Well, we all have New Year's resolutions. Do we write them down with the intention to fail? No, we write them down with the intention to succeed, but often something gets in the way. We have to remind ourselves that success is not random, it's a formula. But intention and knowledge alone don't create the change that we need. It's driven by action, and that action needs to have a specific process that we can follow. Mastery can be distilled to a simple 4-step process. So let's get into the steps. 1. Start at the simplest part first. You don't know what you don't know. Step 2. Focus on the highest frequency plus consistency that you can manage to balance time and, if needed, recovery. Step 3. Focus on one part at a time and maintain a speed that you can both track and control. And Step 4. Let the motor run. In other words, don't interfere. Recognize this process as a loop to further integrate individual skills. Now, principle-based learning is often much more desirable to achieve mastery than technique-based learning. Technique-based is critical as it grounds the principle in concrete terms. However, the foundation for mastery rests on principles. Why? Well, there's 2 reasons. You'll certainly do things wrong on your path to mastery, which is perfectly acceptable. However, you also need to limit the amount you do incorrectly to maximize the number of correct repetitions you perform. Now, to course correct, you need to understand the underlying principle. The second reason is if you want an unmastered skill to be useful to its highest degree at every point along the learning curve, then you need to understand which parts of the technique are the most essential and which are safely developed over time. Again, this is driven by the principle. For a principle to be good, it needs to have sufficient specificity that will actually guide the training or development in highly specific ways. I'll give you a common martial arts analogy. The principle to use an opponent's energy against him. Virtually every martial art claims to abide by this principle, but because it lacks clear specificity, we get the million iterations. Are all equally as good? That's hardly the case, right? So what makes a principle really work is how it is applied, which requires that greater specificity. Let's take a quick example from the martial art that I teach called Chunjo, which is a survival self-defense method. So we apply that principle, the using the opponent's energy against him, in 2 primary ways, jamming and acceleration. Both of these principles often destabilize an opponent, making him otherwise weaker and allowing for advantage in position and counterattacks. Now, these specific techniques within the principle of jamming or acceleration grounds these principles into clear, demonstrable, repeatable, pressure-tested practice. This way, I know how, why, and even if it works and why it didn't work in a particular situation. But I've had a lot of training in martial arts over the years, and there's very few that actually approached it from this position. But I can tell you both from experience in that setting and my own experience in teaching other students over the last 13 plus years, that it makes a world of difference in both speed and depth of learning by starting with a strong principle-based learning model and then, of course, grounding it in the specific techniques. So imagine that we are trying to develop a martial arts skill such as a strike. And for our purposes, it can be any strike, a hook, a jab, palm strike, whatever. It just doesn't matter because we're going to start with the principle. The principle for any strike is to ensure that the force load is distributed through the bone structures and not on any one part, especially any joint. Right? So observing this will allow us to scale that as speed and power are developed, there's also safety built in. And this will help us to avoid injury due to striking incorrectly. Now, we might also need a principle describing the targeting, such as strike to any relatively soft area. This will not only maximize the damage inflicted, but simultaneously protect us against injury again for poor targeting. So contrast that with me just sharing the technique of a strike, say a straight punch. I'd tell you where the strike begins. I'd say use these knuckles. I'd tell you how to drive with the legs and various other details. But not understanding the underlying principle will limit its application and increase the chance of injury because I can quickly use all of that technique in a way that works against me. As I'm building that movement, if I'm off a little bit, which I'm bound to be, right? I'm bound to make some early mistakes as I'm developing this new technique. If I don't understand what I'm supposed to feel in my body by feeling that force load all the way through the forearm bones, for example, right? If I'm feeling it shocked into my knuckle or in my shoulder joint, something like that, well, that's a really good chance that I'm going to use increased speed and power that's going to end up harming me, okay? But on the other hand, if I understand that underlying aspect, well, then what I can do is as I'm scaling it and I feel something slightly off, maybe I feel pressure in the wrist, for example, I know I need to adjust my angle as a result. Or if I feel pressure in one particular knuckle early on, I can start to adjust that angle so that I get better distribution throughout the entire surface. If I'm feeling my shoulder get shocked, again, I can make the necessary adjustments without that extra instruction. Right? Just by having that initial knowledge that it needs to be shared throughout the bone structure, I know if I'm making a mistake internally as it's happening. That can save you a lot of time, of course, in the development, and then it can avoid those pitfalls that could set you back for an extended period of time.